Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're calling from. This is Dina Fidas. My pronouns are she and her. I'm the Managing Director, Chief Program and Partnerships Officer here at Out and Equal. If you dialed in for our session entitled What's Your Pronoun, you are in the right place. We had just an extraordinary response to today's session. We are expecting hundreds of people, and so I'm seeing the numbers tick up. And thank everybody for your patience, because I think we're going to wait just another minute or two before we officially begin. Thanks again, everybody. Just hang tight. We've got a number of people still coming into the Zoom, and we'll get started at 2 or 3 minutes past the hour. Okay. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. I find that Zoom these days, it's a bit like popping popcorn. When the pops are spaced enough apart, you know it's time to go. So we've got about 220 people in the Zoom right now, looks like from around the world. Thank you all for joining us. We expect more. And of course, we will be, as we typically do, recording this session. And we'll make that available after the call. So here we are. My name is Dina Fidas. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the Managing Director and Chief Program and Partnerships Officer here at Out and Equal. And we are so excited to have you all here. We knew that we were, in creating this latest resource that's online by the title, What's Your Pronoun? Strategies for Inclusion in the Workplace. It was very much our response to so many of our corporate and federal agency partners that were looking around and saying, you know, I'm starting to see pronouns pop up. I'm starting to see this wherever I look, and I'm wondering, what is it? How can we adopt these changes internally? And, you know, can you help us? Can you be our friend in this work and give us some practical tips? And that's exactly why we're here today. Let's go ahead to the next slide there. Thanks. So again, I think many of you, most of you, if not all, are very used to Zoom virtual sessions at this point. But very briefly, worth repeating here that we welcome your questions and comments in the chat box. You are very welcome to submit those throughout the session. If you have trouble with hearing my voice or my other presenter's voice, we find that troubleshooting with speakers and headsets, turning the volume way up is usually the best. And again, for those who prefer to follow along with the written word, we've got the slides on the screen, We've got the online resource, and we will be distributing this after the session today. At any time, we welcome your feedback. It's how we craft and develop resources that meet your needs. Drop us a line at hello@outandequal.org. Again, that's hello at, all one word, outandequal.org. So I've introduced myself, and in just a few moments, you will be hearing from my wonderful colleague, Madeline Jelpe, who is the Senior Manager of Stakeholder Engagement here at Out and Equal. And I'll go ahead and highlight, because I know Madeline is going to give us some personal insights here. Notice the pronoun listing, she, her on my side, and pronouns under Madeline Jelpe, anything respectful. And so in addition to Madeline's expertise, we always appreciate hearing that life perspective and individual experience. It certainly enriches all the work that we do. So I want to begin with what was a real turning point, you know, in our popular discourse here. Many of you perhaps saw the CNN LGBT town hall that I think was done in partnership with the Human Rights Campaign and CNN. And then presidential hopeful Kamala Harris got on stage and introduced herself by name and said that her pronouns were she and her. And the moderator, Chris Cuomo, who has certainly, you know, in the course of his career, been a vocal ally for the LGBT community, his head went back and he said, "Oh, me too." And I decided to kick off today's call with this snapshot in time, because I think it highlights some of the dynamics that are at play when we talk about pronouns. When we're talking about pronouns, in effect, we are talking about surfacing something, making it visible or audible in a way that traditionally has not been visible or audible, and that's our gender identity. It's how we identify internally, how we know ourselves to be, and how we want to be received in the world. And, you know, having done LGBT plus inclusion for 13 years plus now, I'm not the longest running advocate, I'm not the shortest running advocate, but, you know, I have seen the evolution of particularly corporate America on this, and we so frequently reference LGBT diversity as a diversity, an element of diversity that's not visible. In other words, you can't take a photograph of a room and be able to pick out who looks LGBT. And when we make ourselves visible or audible, or in other words, recognized, we are in many ways disrupting the norm. We're disrupting what is, for so many people, taken for granted. It's possible that Chris Cuomo and Kamala Harris have never once in their lives been called the wrong pronouns. It's possible that they've moved through life being able to take for granted that how they appear and how they are read by other people aligns with who they know themselves to be. But what this moment showed was in my estimation, a moment of allyship from Kamala Harris to state her pronouns up front. And there was a moment of awkwardness from Chris Cuomo. And you see on the screen here, he ended up taking to Twitter, as is now the norm, to apologize. And it highlighted the fact that when we are presented with something we don't understand or we're surprised by, we sometimes don't bring our best selves to that interaction. We might make a joke of it, we might snicker, we might laugh, we might awkwardly mirror back to somebody as he did, "Me too." And that doesn't mean that he's a bad person taking it into the workplace. Had this interaction happened, though, in a weekly team meeting, and it was the big boss who tilted his head back at first hearing somebody's pronouns and made a joke, that very well may have shut down a productive and helpful conversation about gender identity, gender expression, and gender recognition in the workplace. And so we come to you not with judgment for people who feel awkward about this, but actually with a great deal of compassion and a desire to move this conversation forward. And so with all of our resources, we put them out into the world, and then we look to you, our key partners, going on almost 300 people online today, to give us your input. So again, we welcome it, hello@outandequal.org or in the chat box. So let's go ahead then to the next slide as we're talking about pronouns in the context of our everyday reality. You might find that it can be quite difficult to get through 15 minutes of interaction, whether written or in person, and not invoke somebody's pronouns. You know, good afternoon, sir, we're pleased. Well, sir is an honorific, but it's a gendered term. We use gendered terms and gendered assumptions throughout the day. Can you get it to her desk by Monday? I think Layla accepted the meeting invite. Let me ping her. So you may have found yourself taking for granted that that nanosecond assumption of a person's gender identity is actually correct. And as we'll learn over the course of this session, not only do we need to rethink many of our own assumptions, those of us who, and I include myself in this, who, for example, are cisgender and have moved through the world with maybe one or two exceptions, almost exclusively being read as my gender identity, it's also incumbent upon us to surface gender identity and our pronouns to, in effect, share the education, share the educational burden. It is not on the shoulders of those who are constantly misgendered or those who identify as trans or non-binary to be the world's educators. It is on all of us. And so I know you all are here because you're committed to this work, and I thank you for it. So with that, let me go ahead and pass the baton to my colleague, Madeline Jelpe, to walk us through some of the nuts and bolts of this resource and the concepts.
Thanks so much, Dina, and thank you all so much for being here today, for joining. We have a minute. Oh, I think I was muted. Hi, sorry about that. But as Dina mentioned, my name is Madeline Jelpe, and I am the Senior Manager of Stakeholder Engagement here at Out and Equal. My pronouns are anything respectful is fine with me. I'll get into what that means a little bit further in our presentation, but I just wanted to let you know how excited we are all here at Out and Equal to see so many of you here joining up for this conversation, to see so many people interested in learning a few best practices that you can implement in the workplace around pronouns. So if we go to the next slide, before we get into some of the specifics, some of those important pieces of practical guidance around pronoun usage, I really want to highlight why this is particularly important, focusing a lot on the why before we get into the how. Number one, gender is more expansive than ever before. And I should add the caveat here and say that our society is in fact moving towards accepting and understanding just how expansive gender is and can be. And if you go a couple of more slides, Karina, we can see how the research demonstrates that nearly half of Americans now see gender on a spectrum and feel comfortable using gender neutral pronouns. These are figures which we actually expect to see continue to rise over time as more people have conversations like this, as we continue to be educated and understand what it all means. And if we go to the next slide, we can also see how society is moving towards greater inclusion. In present day, we see that 1 in 3 adults ages 18 to 29 actually know someone who uses gender neutral pronouns. We see this familiarity and higher comfort level, especially with our younger generations. So 12% of millennials identify as transgender or gender nonconforming, which is actually double the percentage of those who identify as transgender or gender nonconforming in Generation X. Younger generations, again, we're seeing them demonstrate this higher familiarity and comfort level with gender-neutral terms, but we're also seeing U.S. society as a whole increasingly embrace gender-neutral language and the transgender and gender nonconforming community. Actually, in 2019, this is something that it's really cool that happened. Merriam-Webster added the singular use of the pronoun they to the dictionary to acknowledge sort of the increased adoption of the word by the non-binary community. And because of this, they named it the word of the year in 2019 after internet searches for the term actually rose by 313% from the previous year. So we're seeing a lot more interest here, a lot more, I guess, yearning to understand pronouns and how they show up in our everyday lives. So moving on to number 2, employees seek gender inclusive policies. We see this in research, and we also see this in our stakeholder base. People want to work for companies that value inclusivity. They want to work for companies that are culturally competent, organizations that leverage diversity and inclusion as strengths and implement practices that cultivate a sense of belonging in all employees. In fact, you could see that actually a majority of Americans now support gender inclusivity in the workplace. So 59% of Gen Zers believe that forms and profiles should contain options outside of male and female, while 74% of respondents in a recent survey that Out and Equal conducted believe that employers should learn and use employees' pronouns and chosen name in the workplace. We can also see a few other stats teased out. So 65% of those respondents agreed that employers should actually intervene when an employee regularly misuses a coworker's pronouns, while 58% believe that regular misuse is a form of workplace harassment. Moving on to number 3, inclusivity improves businesses. So we somewhat know this intuitively and anecdotally, but research demonstrates this important point as well. Inclusivity drives numbers. It can sometimes be that make or break factor in someone staying or leaving a company, someone applying or not applying for that job, or going even further, it can mean the difference in what people bring with them to the workplace, how they show up. And we can see some of the research that demonstrates that. If we go to the next slide, we can see what happens when inclusivity is not a part of the picture. In the Human Rights Campaign's report, the Workplace Divided report, we can see that nearly half of LGBTQ workers remain closeted at work. 1 in 10 have left jobs because they were not accepting, but actually 1 in 4 stayed because an environment was accepting. When people feel accepted, they're more inclined to stay. We also see in research that LGBTQ supportive policies are associated with higher company value, productivity, and profitability. And younger generations in particular are seeking employment at companies that share their own values of inclusion. So there's some really interesting research out there to highlight why this is so important to integrate into your workplace. Moving on to the next slide, simply put, pronouns matter. We've highlighted this in our resource, but I especially want to reiterate it now. Pronouns are about people. They are personal, they are important, just as our names are important. They're not optional, and they matter to how we feel and how we show up in our lives. So going a bit further, using someone's pronouns makes a difference in their mental health and well-being, particularly for transgender and gender nonconforming folks. So when someone's misgendered, when a transgender or non-binary person is misgendered, it adds to that variety of challenges that they may be encountering already. It can cause a range of difficult feelings, dysphoria, anxiety, depression, lowered self-esteem, and embarrassment. These are just a few things that might come up here. But when we have gender affirmative support, in the mix, it can have a powerful and potentially life-saving impact here. It's associated with lower rates of suicidal thoughts and attempts, and overall can reduce depression, improve self-esteem, and create a better quality of life for transgender and non-binary employees. And I think it's especially important to highlight this quote. Using an individual's correct pronouns is a powerful affirmation of self for transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. It validates one's identity, encourages authenticity, and builds truly inclusive and supportive cultures. And going beyond this, this is an important practice, not just for LGBTQ community members, but it's vital for that. We've included this in our resource, but it's vital for that CFO who is a cisgender woman who is constantly misgendered because her voice is lower, or for a feminine presenting cisgender male flight attendant who is constantly called ma'am, referred to as ma'am. And it's also helpful for an increased global cultural competency when we're interacting with employees or clients from different countries, people who are non-native speakers, unfamiliar with traditionally gendered names. So now, we talked about some of the why, but let's talk a bit more about the how. How do we make this a reality in our company? And to utilize these practices, we have to sort of get a baseline understanding of what we mean when we say pronouns. It sort of harkens us back to our grammar school English classes, perhaps, learning about what it means. What is a pronoun? Where does it fall in a sentence, et cetera, et cetera. So in place of an individual's name, we use pronouns like you, she, he, they, to avoid saying the same word over and over and over again. So instead of saying, hi, Madeline is here, I'm so glad Madeline is here, Madeline always does such a good job, we have words in place of that to avoid sort of that repetition. We have a pretty comprehensive chart here sort of laying out the different pronouns you may encounter. He and she typically refer to male and female identified folks, whereas gender neutral pronouns do not associate the subject of a sentence with a particular gender. So the majority of non-binary folks or gender expansive individuals, so people who identify as genderqueer, gender nonconforming, agender, et cetera, often do not identify with he and she pronouns, though there are some exceptions there. Instead, many choose to use terms that are gender neutral, pronouns that align better with their sense of self. So people will commonly utilize they, them, theirs as their pronoun of choice, as this one is the most commonly used gender neutral pronoun in the English speaking non-binary community. However, it's just one of many. And you can see we've included two other options here that you might encounter. So Z here, here's, Z, zir, zirs. And there's a few examples on how to use that in the sentence to get sort of your mind around how you might see those show up when we have conversations around pronouns. I'm going to turn it back to Dina to jump into laying the foundation here in pronoun inclusivity, but I'm looking forward to jumping back in and diving a bit more deeper into this. So I'm going to hand it over to Dina, who's going to talk more.
Terrific. Thank you so much. So I'll kick off with, let's do 3 foundational elements here, sort of palm card set of tips. 1, naming pronouns, not preferred pronouns. Not that any of us want to be the quote unquote language police, but in terms of communicating an evolved sensibility here, pronouns is more than sufficient. Preferred pronouns can open the door inadvertently, perhaps, to matters of choice or subjectivity, and just want to avoid that in the workplace in particular, and anywhere, but we're focused on the workplace. Identifying pronouns should be voluntary. So, for example, if week to week in your round robin Monday meeting, you notice that somebody does not name their pronoun, you don't want to put that person on the spot. or pressure them to share their pronouns. Just as one's internal sense of self, internal sense of gender identity might evolve. Uh, at any given moment, an individual might also be struggling or wanting to decide how and when to inform colleagues of their own evolution on gender identity expression and then by extension pronouns. So giving people that respectful space. It is okay to gently remind people to say, oh, if you feel like it, we're also giving our pronouns, but again, not to point fingers or isolate any one person for not giving their pronouns. Number 3, inclusive pronoun practices are one piece of the puzzle. I wish I could sort of stamp this on my forehead, meaning that we as Out and Equal, and I know you are committed partners, we're in the business of belonging, as my background says. And what that means is a multi-pronged set of policies, practices, interventions, trainings, and resources that all encompasses a broad culture of belonging, and any one practice in isolation won't get you there. It's also worth noting that with the LGBTQ community not enjoying, for example, federal employment protections, and we, of course, have a pending Supreme Court case on our protections under Title VII, at a minimum, you want to understand whether or not your employer has gender identity and sexual orientation protections. So baseline understanding of the environment in which you're operating is essential to beginning to put this into practice. So let's go to everyone's favorite, meetings. Our next slide. There we go. It is one of the seemingly easiest things you can do, but again, it requires some thoughtfulness to introduce names, roles, and pronouns in your meetings. Understanding that if you have a team that meets every day, every 2 to 3 days, it may feel redundant, or for the sake of time, you jump right into the meeting. So we're not suggesting that you pause every single meeting to do a full round robin of name, pronoun, and role. But it is worth noting, particularly when you have new people arriving to a team, to go ahead and orient everyone to norms around pronoun introduction. It's also worth noting that people evolve, people change. And so thinking that you know someone's pronoun for the last 6 months doesn't guarantee you know their pronouns for the next 6 months. And that is the culture and sense of psychological safety in the workplace that you want to afford your colleagues. You want to be sure that if someone who previously used she, her pronouns and is evolving in their own individual sense of self and saying, you know what, I'm non-binary and I actually am using they, them, or I want to put out into the world that I'm comfortable using she, her, or they, them. So it really is a good practice to go ahead and make these a regular part of your meetings, and to not presume that because your individual unit or working group has worked together and you haven't had any newcomers in a while, to not presume that that means everybody's pronouns are static. So give people that space, and also be prepared ahead of time. If it is the first time you're doing this in a meeting, use this resource. Have a few lines about why this is important. This resource is free and available online. Give it to your colleagues and say, I'd like us to start naming our pronouns. You can, read a couple lines from this webinar or from the resource as to why. Point people there and say, we may not get this, we're not perfect all the time, but I want to try. I want to have a workplace that honors everyone's gender identity and expression, and this is an important step. You don't have to be an expert in all things LGBT and pronouns to take some of these foundational steps. And that's, again, why we're here, to give you that support and confidence to lead your team to better acknowledge and just become more comfortable with pronouns and naming gender identity in the workplace. Let's go to the next one. This is one of my favorite slides. It just so happens that my colleague is from the South and I've got some Southern lineage. And so one of my favorite gender inclusive ways to address a group is y'all. And any of you, I hope the chat box lights up, any of you who are in the southern part of the United States might know that the plural of y'all is all of y'all, as we say in the South. But this is important. Absolutely. All right. I got some friends in the chat box there. All of y'all. There you go. This is very important when it comes to addressing colleagues, customers, clients. You know, it's 2020, and not to be too glib about it, but gendered assumptions about your clients or your colleagues won't make you necessarily a popular person. So, you know, you can preserve, and I think this is also very important, um, evolving to a place of gender identity and gender consciousness, and also doing away with gendered assumptions. That doesn't cost you formality or respect. Sometimes people have a false choice notion that if I'm going to be respectful, I must say, attention, ladies and gentlemen, or sir, you dropped this. In fact, there are a number of gender inclusive ways to signal respect that also translate to even greater acknowledgement of the diversity of your staff, your clients, et cetera. And so you'll see, you know, across the hospitality industry, fewer and fewer pieces of collateral addressed to ladies and gentlemen, but instead valued guests. You can simply say on the airline, you know, thank you all for choosing us today. So really, there's no need to trade respect for inclusion. They actually are absolutely compatible and strengthen one another. But again, it's perfectly fine. My team can tell you, I often start emails with, hey team. And so again, you know, it speaks to your role, your comfort level, and so forth. But there are a number of ways to evolve away from gendered assumptions. And we'll go to the next one. And so finally, the hiring process. In many ways, this is one of the first in-depth opportunities that new talent has to see your culture of inclusion on display. We are finding more and more that giving an optional place in applications to list one's pronouns has been quite successful. In face-to-face interactions, you know, if you're not used to it now, once you start, it's pretty easy to get used to. You know, hi, I'm Dina. My pronouns are she and her. Been and out and equal now, a year and some change. Pleasure to meet you. So I think that when it comes to introducing pronouns, if you're in the position of being a hiring manager or of interviewing somebody, it can be a great practice to go ahead and offer that up. And for those of you, or if you have dialogue with skeptical people, like, well, didn't you start this call by saying some people are not ready for this, or they're, you know, uncomfortable with this? And I think the point is, particularly when it comes to hiring practices and the interview process, proactively signaling how evolved you are as an employer, that you fully recognize this very important dialogue out there about gender identity and pronouns. That is what's most important. If someone is a touch surprised and says, "Oh, well, my pronouns are they're she, her," there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't detract from the process. And so I would say, you know, lead with your inclusive values, and lead with your confidence and support of the entire potential talent pool ahead of you, which most certainly includes trans, non-binary, cisgender people who have been misgendered. And so you really do cover more inclusion ground when you lead with that. And so I think at this point, I will pass the baton back to Madeline Jelpy. to address some of those more nuanced scenarios where, you know, we're bound to make mistakes or we're bound to need a little bit more support in how we execute this. So let me go ahead and pass it back to Madeline.
Thanks, Dina. And just a couple more tips on this end. Internal forms and records, some of you are already asking questions about this in the chat box, but there are a lot of opportunities to sort of engage in inclusive pronoun practices here. So including opportunities to voluntarily declare pronouns on relevant documentation is one way that you can ensure that you are demonstrating inclusivity, including gender identity options outside of male and female on surveys. This is particularly important if you're doing any self-ID initiatives. And then also when asking employees to list honorifics, it's important to also include the option mix, which is the gender neutral alternative to Mr., Mrs., et cetera. So be sure to include that as you are continuing to lay the foundations within your workplace. And then I think we have one more here. We go to the next slide. This one people ask about a lot. Adding your pronouns to your email signature. This is such an easy way to engage in conversations around pronouns in your workplace. Simply adding your pronouns to your email signature can make a huge difference to you know, how people feel in the workplace. If they see that, you know, they're getting an email from Ali Bassett, pronoun she, her, hers, at least me personally, I take that as a signal of inclusivity. And I also know how to interact with Ali in a way that is respectful to her and how she identifies. So we actually have some good ways to perhaps do this in your workplace. You want to couple adding your pronouns to your email signature with perhaps a communication initiative around why employees may be seeing this in their inboxes and why pronouns might be a part of that. So I encourage you to check out the resource for some of that sample language, but this is a relatively easy change that we hope you all decide to do, especially as we gear up for Pride Month. This is a great opportunity to add that into your signature. So let's jump into some tips for everyday interaction, and really thank you, Dina, for highlighting those really important key points for laying the foundation. But now let's talk a little bit more about how to do this on a person-to-person level. So there are a few key tenets to follow here. Generally, in any sort of social engagement, we encounter a great practice, and actually one of my personal philosophies in life is, at least I try to do this on a regular basis, but avoid assumptions about the other person you're meeting. In general, this can allow us to get to know someone and interact with people in a more deep way. Sociologically speaking, I'm a big sociology nerd, but people often make certain assumptions about others when we're assessing how to interact with new people. And we do that almost intuitively as a part of our process as social beings, right? So to better understand unknown individuals, by sort of taking those clues we can glean from what we know from previous encounters, and then understand how to relate and connect in those new social interactions. So while that might be sort of a relatively ingrained part of our interactions, these unconscious social cues are often based on stereotypes. And those stereotypes can limit our abilities to connect with, understand, and respect the people that we're encountering. So now when we're talking about this in the context of pronouns, what we need to home in on are the assumptions we make about gender on a regular basis. So our assumptions about gender often come up through how somebody looks or how they act, so their behaviors, their voice. This typically happens on the phone. We make assumptions based on an individual's name, and this can happen most commonly in emails, resumes, other written forms of other written documentation for names. Gender identity, however, as Dina mentioned, is not always outwardly apparent. It's not something that we can necessarily see. And so it's that deep internal sense of who we are that perhaps isn't expressed through any external means. For example, I'm typically read as someone who strictly uses she, her pronouns and identifies as cisgender. For me, however, I see my identity as much more fluid than that. And at various points, I'm going through sort of an exploration phase around what I feel is comfortable to me. And I use anything respectful for my pronouns because it expresses that truth for me inside and gives me the freedom to do so. But if you were to make assumptions about me, it wouldn't really hold true to who I am and what I know about myself internally. So one thing that I think is true, when we make assumptions, we often forego the truth of an individual in favor of simplicity. We forego that holistic understanding of somebody in favor of what's comfortable and in favor of what we know, what we're comfortable with in terms of our own framework. So this can create a lot of misalignment. If we're looking from a practical standpoint, we simply get our interactions wrong with others if we don't look beyond our assumptions. It's my belief and the belief of all of us at Out and Equal, we deserve more than that. We all deserve to be seen. So it's really critical we challenge those inclinations to make assumptions about gender and really encouraging you to embrace what can be such a fulfilling process of letting people reveal who they are to you. What are their deep truths? What drives them? How do they identify? Number two, utilize curiosity. And what I mean by this is not necessarily asking questions, though it is important to ask questions, but rather be curious about the people around you versus thinking that you have all the answers. When we utilize curiosity, we go in questioning what we think we know. And I think we are better suited to open ourselves up to possibility. And it again can allow us to be closer to the people around us, more aware of who they are and how they navigate the world. Number three, check yourself. Try to be aware of what you don't know. A lot of implementing these practices is rewiring some of those neuro pathways we've developed throughout our lives to automatically plug in certain words, using gender-specific terms like ladies and gentlemen, or automatically associating a particular pronoun with a name. It's really up to us to check in with ourselves and notice some of those knee-jerk reactions that we have and work through them in ways that challenge that framework, that can limit our own access to spaces of inclusion and also limit others as well. Okay, so now let's move away from some of the philosophy, so to speak, and into the practical applications with this material on sort of an interpersonal level. We get a lot of questions about this one. How do we figure out someone's pronouns when we've just met them or we aren't sure how they identify? Well, here's a few things you can do, a few basic tenets. First of all, listen. We listen to the pronouns others use when referring to that individual. This is especially important. It's especially important to listen to people who know the person well. They're more likely to use the correct pronoun. I will say this is not a foolproof mechanism. It's just sort of a way to start and get a little bit of insight into how someone might identify. Number two, introduce yourself. If you're meeting someone for the first time, it's great to be proactive and introduce yourself with your own pronouns and your name. This gives the other person an opportunity to share their own pronouns. So you might say, hi, it's nice to meet you. My name's Marina. I use she, her pronouns. It's okay if the person doesn't say their pronouns back, but you've given them the space to do so, and that's a great place to start. Number three, ask. In introductions, it's also okay to ask someone how they would like to be addressed. I've had many people do this for me, and I actually really appreciate it. So you might say, hi, my name's Sarah. I go by she, her pronouns. How should I refer to you? And, if you've already met the person and you're still unsure what pronouns to use, it is okay to ask again to gain clarity. However, best practice here is do this in a private space. It's important not to draw additional attention to that conversation. It can create discomfort for the individual you're asking. And overall, just be prepared to provide an explanation as to why sharing pronouns is important. We have some good language within the document, but it's always good to be prepared to address questions that you might get when someone's asking, well, I don't understand why you're doing that. I don't get why it's so important. And, it's important because the assumptions we make about people can be wrong. And I think that many people can grab onto that idea. But check out the resource. There's some good language in here to help you frame that conversation. Lastly, keep it optional. As we mentioned before, sharing pronouns should be voluntary because some individuals simply aren't ready to do that. Some people are in an exploration phase. We want to avoid outing people. And a good practice to sort of default back on if you still don't know someone's pronouns is to just simply use their name. That is a very respectful way to address someone and a good practice if you are still unsure of their pronouns. Moving on to the next slide, I think one of the things people find most difficult about inclusive practices around pronouns is really being unsure what to do if you mess up, or being worried that you may in fact mess up, and sort of the discomfort that comes along with that. We've talked a little bit about misgendering before, but when you use a pronoun for someone that doesn't align with their gender identity, we call that misgendering. And it can frequently happen in verbal interactions because we have less time to sort of be intentional about the words we're using, especially if this is new to us. Whether it happens intentionally or accidentally, it can create those intense moments of distress for those being misgendered. So it's really important that you know how to address mistakes sincerely and calmly to sort of avoid further damage there. So a few key tenets to follow: acknowledge your mistakes sincerely and calmly. In moments like this, avoid being defensive, demonstrate accountability. That can really make a huge difference in how, in the impact that this can have on the individual. Apologize and correct yourself. You may say something along the lines of, I'm sorry, Tori, I should have said she, or she mentioned, I'm sorry, they mentioned. And then going on, don't draw additional attention to the situation by spending a lot of time on the mistake. That can create additional awkwardness or discomfort. A good practice is just to simply apologize and move on. Number 4, if you have been corrected for misgendering someone, a good practice is to thank the person for correcting you. This may sound like a simple thing, but it can actually reinforce some healthy behaviors around giving and receiving constructive feedback. Number 5, take time to self-reflect. Again, retraining your brain to use some of this language is going to take some time, and it does require intentionality and forethought. So taking some time to practice and self-reflect is really going to make a difference here. Next slide. As you think about some of the practices we talked about, I really want to highlight it's important to be proactive in this process and sort of setting up some mechanisms to ensure that you're anticipating where people might be confused or resistant to that change. Utilizing pronouns in this way has only become more prevalent recently, so we want to make sure we have some things in place to sort of mitigate that and address it before it becomes a problem. So jumping into organizational level planning, first let's take a look at some of the key pieces here. Providing information and training that specifically addresses transgender and gender nonconforming identities. Training is really key here. It can help people understand gender identity as a whole more thoroughly, and it's really going to help people tap into some of the larger concepts associated with pronoun inclusivity. Number two, execute thoughtful internal communication plans to explain changes in policy and procedures around pronouns and connect initiatives to your company values. We want you to ensure that your employees know why, why they should be doing this, how this connects to your company values. This can go a long way to ensure that individuals know that this is a priority at your company, really drawing that line between this practice and why it matters to your company. Number three, offer spaces for follow-up conversations for more clarity and direction. This is particularly important for folks who don't necessarily understand at first. Not everyone's going to be on board at the same time, and it's really important to have spaces for people to ask questions and talk about that. And then prepare managers to address questions and issues around pronouns. This is very important. Managers can be key pieces in sort of ensuring that these practices are implemented and carried through effectively. So if you have any questions on how to do that, we encourage you to reach out to Out and Equal, and we're happy to help you on that journey there. Last piece here is the interpersonal level approach. And I'll just briefly go through this because I know we want some time for questions here, but a few key tenets here is ensuring that you are proactively planning to understand, your role as potentially an ally, and sort of prepare for those verbal interactions we talked about before that can also be spots that you're more likely to potentially struggle there. So I think generally utilizing empathy is an important tool here. Asking yourself these key questions to familiarize yourself with the emotional element of all of this is, can I identify with their needs and interests? Have I experienced something similar or encountered moments where I needed to be better acknowledged or more seen? What emotions do I see that the other individual is potentially feeling that I too have encountered? Connecting to past experiences is important. It might feel like a new concept to use gender neutral pronouns in singular form, but think about that time you saw an employee's backpack left behind after a meeting and you didn't know whose it was, so you said, does anyone know who left their folder on the table? These are instances where we've used this language before, and it's helpful to sort of connect back to that when you're thinking of using this. Learn. There are a variety of resources out there that you can learn from to engage in this material more. Madeline will share our best practices for non-binary inclusion in the chat box so that you all can continue to build some of that knowledge on your own. We also have other resources we can recommend to you if you still have questions. And then lastly, practice. So getting pronouns right, this can require, again, concerted effort. But if you keep at it, in no time at all, this will be something that's really intuitive and something that you feel really comfortable with. So I'm going to jump into it looks like we have one more slide, and I think we have a bunch of questions popping up though, so I want to make sure we have some time to answer that. Yeah, so let's move into our Q&A. I see Dina's jumped on, and we're going to have Madeline Peru, our other Madeline at Out and Equal, help us address some of the questions that you all have.
Yeah, thank you, Madeline Jelpy. Thank you all. I am going to go ahead and jump in on a time check, which is we have just been bowled over by the level of engagement on this call. It is 7 minutes before the hour, and we typically keep to the minute when it comes to Out and Equal virtual sessions. However, the three of us can remain on the line for 5 or 10 minutes afterwards, and we will also be around to answer your questions. So for those of you that want to hang out with us, you're very welcome to. And again, all of this content is in the resource that Madeline Peru is going to put in the chat box, and we'll also be following up with you over email. So thank you again. A few of the questions that I wanted to be sure we get up front is there's a great question about sort of being on the other side. What if you are in a client or customer facing position and you are misgendered. So someone says, thank you, ma'am, and you would actually use he, him pronouns, and in that case wouldn't mind being called sir. I think one of the great tools in the toolbox is sort of per Madeline's skill development here is, recognizing that that individual might actually be attempting to show you respect. So you can acknowledge that and say, I appreciate that you're wanting to show me respect. Actually, what would be most respectful for me is sir. Or if you are, for example, non-binary and you don't like any of the options, sir, ma'am, or some configuration of new language, simply saying, actually, I prefer to be called Dina. Thank you so much. I appreciate you respecting that. And you can practice it with a smile. And so again, sort of, if this is something that is happening, it may be worth a little bit of practice, as I think we all sort of want to move through the world with, by reflecting back to someone what they're attempting to do, which is show you respect, and also holding solid to who you are. A couple of other questions or themes of questions that have popped up here. We certainly would not give legal advice. What we can offer to the questions about, well, when asking for a pronoun in a job application potentially open up lawsuits, this is a practice that corporations are adopting. And we also know that throughout an interview process, one's pronouns are going to be invoked. So, for example, if I bring somebody onto a Zoom call or into the office, and I turn to my head of HR and say, thanks, Red, for joining us. She was just telling me. So it's almost impossible to think through the whole interview process without invoking pronouns. And this is generally viewed as a way to simply ensure that you're using the right pronouns for that individual applicant. From an inclusion perspective and sort of a corporate reputation perspective, soliciting pronouns can definitely be received by a wide cross-section of people, particularly younger employees, or prospective employees, as an important signal to them that they are welcome and wanted within your firm. A couple of other folks have dialed in and said, hey, I'm not LGBT. Should I still use my pronouns? Should I still state my pronouns? And the answer is yes, an emphatic yes. Especially, again, I'll just sort of invoke, my experience in the world. I identify as LGBT and I'm cisgender. And so it is vital that I talk about my pronouns just as much as a colleague who's non-binary, trans, or cis does. And I think we did have another question from someone who identifies as trans and was wondering about beginning that conversation and kind of avoiding maybe some awkwardness there. And I think a few quick points of support and open questions for you is, one, do you have an ally or someone you trust within your working team who can either be a buddy in this effort or be the one to introduce it? As we said at sort of the top of the call, it is important that the educational component of pronouns does not fall exclusively on people who are trans or non-binary. I'm seeing a lot of head nods from Madeline Jelpy, so I'm going to pause there as I know you're wanting to dive into some of these as well.
Well, I just want to add another example of why allyship is important here, and Dina demonstrates this pretty well for us at Out and Equal is, if somebody just so happens to forget to say their pronouns in introductions, Dina will follow up and say, hey all, I just want to remind you, we're sharing our pronouns today. And I think that from, someone who, identifies with pronouns that aren't typical, so anything respectful, that for me is a really great demonstration of allyship. And one of the ways where this can apply to you as an ally is ensuring that, you are asking that question and stepping into a role that ensures people have a space to share that. So anyway, I just wanted to say that for our allies out there that yes, this absolutely applies to you, and you actually have a really important role here to ensure that these conversations are had. Looking into some of the other questions, let's see.
Yeah. or Madeline, Peru, were there some that you had also noted over the course of the call? If you want to pop in on audio or video, that'd be great.
Sure. So we have a question saying, you had mentioned, Madeline, that giving pronouns should be voluntary, but if you're starting a meeting asking folks to give their pronoun, how can you form that question to make sure it's not putting people on the spot? So it's still voluntary, but you still want to make sure that people are sharing and feel comfortable to share.
Yeah, I think this is an important one, and I'm glad you asked that question because there is some nuance there. You know, we are asking people for their pronouns, and then people might not be in a space to share. So I think adding to that question, you know, if you'd like to refrain from this, totally understandable. Not everyone, you know, is perhaps in a place to share this, or you know, may like to share at a later time, that's fine too. We just want to set the space open, keep the space open for questions like that, or for pronouns to be identified. Dina, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I would say that there's potentially a bit of situational awareness or subjectivity here. I would be concerned, and I would raise this issue if pronouns are voluntary and you have a scenario in which everyone around the table who's cisgender does not give their pronoun, and then the one person who colleagues know is trans does. So, you know, this would not be, you know, sometimes a little bit of knowledge is not a good thing, in that, you know, knowing it's voluntary, well, what does that mean? And so, you know, that it may require some bold conversations to say, and explain perhaps the way we did. You know, the reason this is voluntary is that we know some people may be evolving in their sense of self, and we want to give that space. We also want to make more apparent gender identity in the workplace, respectful acknowledgement of one another's gender identity, and that's really why we're asking it. So, you know, if there's a sort of, we all know it when we see it, if there's some crossed-armed resistance happening at the table, there's an underlying culture issue there to address. But again, you know, keeping a pace with this and letting folks know the why of the practice.
Thank you. Another question that might be a little more how to put these pronouns into practice from a logistics standpoint is, how, if a company has inclusive pronoun practices, how does that translate into the need for government forms or reporting out? And how can you make sure that the employer is managing inclusive pronoun and gender identity options in their hiring forms, but also needing to report out in government forms that are less flexible?
Yeah, so thank you. Again, I want a big, bright lighted caveat that we are not giving legal advice here, but what we can surface for you are common practices and sort of some of the consensus across the private sector. I am unaware of any government reporting mechanism that requires pronouns. Rather, EEOC requirements cover some of the protected categories, you know, race, disability, sex, et cetera. But as we've, you know, talked about, and as we're on the heels of a Supreme Court decision, sexual orientation and gender identity are not federally protected categories. There is no federal collection mechanism for that. And so generally speaking, corporate practices and employer practices around pronouns do not intersect with federal reporting requirements. One thing that I think could be helpful here in terms of a frame of reference, and I think somebody very astutely brought this up, taking it out of an LGBT context, if I am meeting somebody for the first time, or I have interest in a candidate for a job, I will respectfully acknowledge my pronouns, my name, and I might ask that individual, because I might have a packet of information in which I have somebody's legal name, but I might ask, is there a name that you go by other than what I have here? That allows for a range of individuals. individuals who, you know, unfortunately are tired of having their name mispronounced and go by a shortened name in the United States, for example. Somebody who has not been able to finalize their divorce papers, but really doesn't want you to call to address them by their former, you know, soon to be former married last name, but that is still the legal name. So there are a whole range of reasons to respectfully articulate to a candidate, you know, here's who I am. You're welcome to let me know how best to introduce you. That's another kind of softer way to say it. How would you like me to introduce you to our colleagues? My pronouns are this. My name is Dina. You're welcome to call me Dee. You know, so there are ways to make this both professional and also conversational and friendly. Madeline, did you want to jump in as well?
No, I think that was all really clear. Yeah, I'm just looking through some of the other questions. What are examples of using a pronoun that is anything respectful outside of male, female, they, and ze? I wonder if we can actually link a chart that shows a few more. Some people actually use things like they prefer to just use their name, for example, instead of pronouns. I met someone who used whatever as their pronoun, the literal word whatever. And so that for them felt like a comfortable place to be. So I think that there's sort of a broad category of pronouns that people might use that are gender neutral. You will typically see those that you listed though. So he, she, they, ze, those are the most common ones that you will likely encounter.
We have a request, Karina, if you don't mind showing that slide again that has the chart of pronouns that Madeline went over. If you could just pull that up really fast, that would be great.
And also within the resource there, we have examples of what that looks like in other countries, gender neutral alternatives. So I encourage you to check that out for you to see how this shows up in non-English speaking languages or languages outside of English.
One question that came in, Madeline, and you had covered it briefly, was how to approach Mr., Miss, Mrs. in formal written communications when you're unsure of what pronouns or what people's gender identity is. Could you touch on that again briefly?
Sure. And I'm assuming this is, you haven't talked to someone yet, and you're applying for a job and you want to ensure you're doing so in a formal way. I think that a best practice here is just, again, use their name. We've had this question come up before, but overall, you know, we don't want to make these assumptions about gender. And, you know, there's a lot of harm that could come from the wrong use of Mr. or Mrs. And so I think it's best to just, again, use someone's name. If you are not sure what honorific that person uses or unsure of what pronouns they use. That's a great question, though.
And I'm not seeing any additional questions coming in at this time. I know we're a few minutes over, but as always, you can follow up with us at hello@outandequal.org, and I'll put that in the chat box one more time. Ina and Madeline, do you want to say a few words to close us out?
Sure, I'll just jump in and say how exciting it is that all of you are here on today's call. We had quite literally hundreds of you joining in for this conversation, and that I hope brings you as much joy as it brings me. It means these conversations are happening and that people are willing participants, and there's so much learning happening there. So I just really appreciate you being here, and I'll let Dina have the final word. It looks like you want to say something.
Oh, sure. So two things. The first, anybody who's dialed into these virtual sessions and heard from me may have heard this before. I think it's vital. If you do nothing else today, tell one or two people how you just spent the last hour. Because for someone who's unsure if they're the only one in the office, notice how I use they, in other words, not assuming gender, they're the only one in the office or the business group who has been thinking about pronouns, the fact that you just signaled and said, yeah, I just attended an Out and Equal session on that, that can forge a connection that otherwise wouldn't exist. That's how you find other allies, other vested colleagues in this overall work. The second is, and we'll be following up with an email, one of the easiest things that we find is at the bottom of our signature lines in an email, we list our pronouns. And now we're just going to hyperlink that to this resource. So, you know, if someone's scanning and they haven't seen this before, or they've been afraid to ask, they click on that and then they get this, what is now hopefully you all are finding as we are a beautiful, succinct resource about pronouns. So this is our gift to you. We want the conversation to continue. I'm so appreciative of the dialogue in the chat box. All of you, the time and thoughtful consideration you give to this shared work of LGBT equality enriches all of these resources that we develop. So thank you again, particularly those of you that shared what it feels like to be misgendered. We want to shoulder that burden, take it off of you, and move forward with these types of educational resources. So do stay in touch. Thank you all. Be well, and we will see you at our next virtual session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.